Pleasure to introduce to you all Alicia McBride, who is the Director of Quaker Leadership at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, where she's previously worked in communication, integrated strategy, and impact assessment. Her work at FCNL is to, quote, nurture, expand, and deepen relationships with friends across the United States. And she also helps interpret the spiritual basis of FCNL's advocacy work. So welcome, Alicia, and thank you so much for taking your time to be with us this evening.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I will add a few things to my introduction that is helpful to know about me as we get started. One is that I am obviously coming to you from my home. And I have a family of musicians. So if you hear a piano playing in the background or things like that, this is the time of night where that happens in my house. A couple of other things. I was raised in the Episcopal Church and became a Quaker in my early 20s, in part through my experience of working at FCNL in my early years right out of college. And I am not a natural lobbyist. So it's somewhat ironic that I have spent my career working for a lobbying organization. I'm much more of a writer than a speaker. I don't like debates. Conflict sometimes makes me a little itchy. But I do this work because I feel called to it and because it is a way to connect my faith and a moral conviction with the ways that we are all trying to live together in this world. So all of those things together come sort of shape the way that I approach advocacy and civic engagement and spirit in action, and what I hope to share with you this evening. How do we engage with politics without losing our souls in the process? How do we engage with people who hold really different viewpoints? And how do we do it together and not just as a collection of individuals? And I will just say, Renee, that there's a workshop that I do with one of my colleagues so Quakers are also known as the Religious Society of Friends. So there's lots of friends, puns, and clever names when you're in Quaker circles. And we call it Friends in Unlikely Places, this workshop where we talk about ways of approaching people who hold really different viewpoints and how to find points of connection. So I know that all of you probably have, there's a wide range of experience and understanding of all of the topics we'll cover. So I'm going to cover some things that for some of you may be old hat, but I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. And the first thing I want to talk about is, what do we mean by advocacy or lobbying? I think there are lots of different definitions, but the essential points are really about arguing in support of something. It can be a cause, a policy, a position, and there are lots of different ways that people go about doing that. You can meet in person or now virtually with people in power at the state or local or national level. There's writing emails and letters, publishing letters to the editor, especially if they mention the names of an elected official. You can go to a protest or a demonstration. You can organize in your community. And when I talk, especially when I talk with middle and high school students, I say, we do this all the time. I mean, lobbying, when you say the word lobbying, it sort of creates all of these ideas about, wearing a suit and sitting in a fancy office and scary people who know lots of things about some issue or other. But if you've ever, I say to these students, if you've ever tried to convince your parents to stay up late past your bedtime, or that maybe you should have extra dessert tonight, then you have taken part in advocacy. And I think it's really important to hold on to how normal an activity this is, because when you add in policymakers, it does add in all sorts of levels of complexity. But really the idea of advocating for something that you believe in is something that we're all familiar with and do as part of going through our life. And as we're thinking about what advocacy is and also how that connects to faith, I want to show a short video clip. This is of former Minnesota Representative Keith Ellison, who spoke at our spring lobbying conference for young adults, high school and college students, a couple of years ago. So let me make sure I can do this.
Win just because of your magical moment? I don't know. What do you mean Keith doesn't know? No, he don't. I don't know. But I know this. If you don't go, we will certainly lose. I know that. But if you do go, we just might win. So often in life, it's not a matter of what you know is going to happen. I want to urge you all to reject a prevalent idea that is in our society, which is that folks need to know the end before they even start. Will this bill pass? I don't know. I know this, if we don't fight for it, it won't. Can we stop this bad piece of legislation? I don't know, but I know that if we do fight it, we might win. If we don't, it will pass and people will suffer. It's critical for you to understand that when the reporters and when some of the folks who look like they're really smart start talking about what's going to happen and what isn't going to happen, nobody actually knows what's going to happen. And the truth is that you can increase your odds when you put yourself to a problem. So what your odds are before you start are not the same as what your odds are after you've begun. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? You can increase your odds of success by you impacting the situation. And I want you to know this because I don't want anybody in this room to be under the impression that we're for sure going to defeat this Republican repeal bill. I don't know. But I know that we have to try. I don't care about the odds. I care about what's right and what's wrong. And as long as you're willing to fight for what's right, we have a shot.
All right. I love how he talks about that you can't know the outcome, but you have to try. The odds aren't up to us. The fight is up to us. And I think about how Keith Ellison is talking to these students about lobbying and advocacy and how they go into a congressional office, but he's also talking to them about faith and having faith in the need to do it, even if you don't know what's going to happen. And it reminds me of some words from Mother Teresa, who talked about, we are not called to be successful, we are called to be faithful. And as I said, you can advocate about a lot of things in a lot of different ways. And the specific kind of advocacy we're talking about tonight is really rooted in this faith. It's about doing what is right and necessary to bring the world we want to see into being in the best way we can, using our gifts of strategy and intelligence and relationship. We're not just, praying that it will happen and not doing anything to make it happen. But ultimately, we can't control what happens. We can just put ourselves in the place to do the best we can to try to create what we believe is right. We care about the result, but the most important thing is remaining true to where God is leading. And this is really the basis for how the Friends Committee on National Legislation lobbies. We talk about our lobbying in a language and experience that comes out of a Quaker tradition, which I will share a little bit more about in a minute. But this idea of advocacy rooted in faith is really what connects this one organization to our partners and people across a lot of different traditions. And a little bit later on, I will talk about some of the ways that FCNL works with other faith communities to advocate for the causes that we're working on. But I want to start first by talking a little bit about Quakers and what a particular Quaker approach to advocacy means. And how did Quakers wind up founding the first registered religious lobby in Washington, D.C.? So a little bit about what Quakers believe. The central part of Quakerism to me? Well, the first thing I will say is that Quakerism is an experiential faith. It is really about an individual person's relationship to the divine. A phrase that Quakers often refer to is that there is that of God in everyone. And there's this idea that God continues to speak to us today, that there is continuing revelation. It's not something that just happened in the past. One of the side effects of that, or maybe one of the points of that, is that it's very difficult to have agreement among Quakers about what Quakerism is, because it is very much based on your own experience of that faith. So I tell people when I do orientations for new staff and things like that, I will describe to you my experience of Quakerism. Your mileage may vary. But really, the other aspects of Quakerism and things that you may have heard of or been, be familiar with about Quaker beliefs in peace and pacifism, about equality, about simplicity, about honesty and integrity, really flow out of that core belief about experiential faith and that of God in everyone. Because if every individual can access God, then the choice to take a life is really a choice to remove that possibility of what piece of God that person has from the world. And that's a pretty terrible thing to do. The idea of equality, that anybody can have access to the divine, regardless of their background, their gender, their age, their life experience. Quakers did not, one of the things that got Quakers in trouble was that, particularly in the early part of their history, was that they didn't respect the ability of clergy in the Church of England in the 17th century to be the arbiters of what God said. It was accessible to everybody. And as I said, early Quakers were not very popular in England in the time that they were coming into being, which was the late 17th century, a time of political upheaval, a time of plague, a time of when a lot of people thought the world was about to end. So, there's lots of similarities with where we are today, if you think about it. And early Quaker activism and lobbying and working with government really came out of necessity, because Quakers were being persecuted, imprisoned, even executed for their refusal to obey the laws that violated their conscience. And this sense of refusing, this call to dissent and following conscience has continued. And Quakers work for changes that affect them and also for changes that better align with the world that is their sense of where God is calling. I want to also say that there are many ways that Quakers and others do this work and try to create the world that they want to bring into being. The journalist and author Bill Moyers talks about 4 roles of social activism that I think are helpful in thinking about this, and also thinking about where advocacy or lobbying fits into a bigger context. The 4 roles are the helper, which is direct service, the rebel, people who are protesting and disrupting, the organizer, who is building a movement and training people, and the advocate, people engaging with existing systems to make change and change those systems. And Moyer says that all 4 of those roles are necessary for social change. And obviously, the work that I am involved in really fits into that advocate category, with a little bit of organizer thrown in. But one of the things I really appreciate about working with FCNL and with other faith groups in DC is that there's not a sense that any one person, any one approach, any one group is doing it the right way and everyone else is doing it the wrong way. That we're all part of this ecosystem that is working to create change, and that these ways are interconnected. And as just one example, having a helper who is engaged in direct service with an affected community, like someone who works in a food bank and knows the needs of the community, having that person go into an office, a congressional office, and say, here is what is happening in your community, and I'm seeing it every day, is a really powerful message to bring to a legislature. So there are ways that these roles can also fit together. And I will share a few resources in the chat. And as I said, I will email these out as well. If you are interested in learning more about sort of Quakers and the connection between Quakers and lobbying, the first is a booklet called Quakers, A Quick Guide. And the second is a theological perspective on Quaker lobbying. And before I get into sort of how that general approach to advocacy leads to the first registered religious lobby in DC, I just want to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions or comments before I keep going. Rebecca?
Could you repeat those 4 roles again?
Yeah, sure. And I can put those in the chat as well. So it's the helper, the rebel, the organizer, and the advocate.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, let me keep going, and feel free to note your question in the chat if you have anything. So here's how we get from here to there, to the organization that I work for. So in the 20th century, Quakers were once again facing imprisonment, this time for their objection to military service, and they're arguing for the rights of individuals to conscientiously object from serving in the military. And once that legal right was established, Quakers were really engaged in creating alternatives to service. And so in 1943, in the middle of World War II, a group of Quakers from 15 different Quaker bodies came together and agreed to create the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And they did it in response to, quote, the sweeping role which government is playing in shaping life, both national and international. And I take a lot of inspiration from the idea that a bunch of Quakers, many of them Midwestern farmers, came together in a small town in Indiana in the middle of incredible uncertainty and the chaos of World War II and said, you know what we need to do? We need to be able to lobby our government. And talk about not knowing the outcome of something that you were going to do. And of course, there were many faith communities before that were lobbying and advocating with the government. But FCNL was the first registered one of those that said, we are an organization that is going to be mostly focused on direct lobbying of the government. We're not going to do it sort of on the side as part of other, activities that we're engaged in. Another really important factor of how this works is that the issues that FCNL works on and has worked on really come out of a consultative process with Quaker communities and congregations across the country. And so this is actually happening right now, where we're asking hundreds of Quaker meetings and churches across the country to let us know what issues and positions they would like us to be focused on. And all of that information gets collected, and through a whole series of processes will lead to a set of priorities that will guide our work in the next session of Congress. So at one point, I remember we were working with a communications consultant, and he said, you should change your name because no one knows what the Friends Committee on National Legislation means. And there's part of, he's kind of right, but also it really is a committee. It is not a collection of staff doing the things that they want to do or that even they think is right to do. It is a committee of people representing people across the country. in advancing the policies that are important to them. And another sort of touchstone for me in this work is a quote from a man named E. Raymond Wilson, who was the very first head of the organization. He served from 1943 into the late 60s. And when he was accepting the position, so very early on, he wrote that we ought to be willing to work for causes which will not be won now, but cannot be won in the future, unless the goals are staked out now and worked for energetically over a period of time. So once again, we're talking about, we may not see the end of this, but we're going to do the thing we believe we have to do now to get to where we want to go. And obviously a lot has changed since 1943. We're almost at 80 years now. In Washington, D.C., in the lobbying, in the organization. And yes, Paige, that is a good metaphor, the planting of seeds. Maybe it's appropriate that a lot of the founders were farmers of the organization. But really, some of the things that connect the FCNL of that 1943 with the work that we do today is this vision of the world we believe we're called to bring into being, and the ways that we are trying to take steps toward that vision. The very first statement of policy that FCNL put out in 1944 said that in approaching the task of lobbying, we should seek both prophetic vision and practical wisdom. And that's really an attitude that has carried through almost unchanged. We have our vision statement, which I will also put in the chat, which I sort of think of as our compass of what the world that we seek. We seek a world free of war and the threat of war. We seek a society with equity and justice for all. We seek a community where every person's potential may be fulfilled, and we seek an earth restored. And that's a pretty big vision. And we can't really go into a congressional office and say, please create a world free of war and the threat of war, because that doesn't feel very practical to a lawmaker. But what we can do is look at the policies that we want to push forward or that we want to oppose and see, how does this advance this world that we seek? And does it advance it? And because everything has some measure of positive and negative, does it advance it enough? And by having that compass that we can use to guide the work that we're doing, we really try to have that prophetic vision, but then advance the practical steps working within this institution of Congress that we can to take us toward the vision. And, you know, FCNL, as you can tell from that statement, we work on a huge number of issues. We work in a lot of ways, areas of concern to Quakers. There are some issues that have emerged over the past 80 years. Climate wasn't really an issue that people were very concerned about in the 40s and 50s as much, but that has become a really important issue for our community. Some issues like nuclear disarmament, concern about the military budget have really been consistent. And some issues have evolved. In the 50s, FCNL testified in support of anti-lynching legislation, and then was one of the organizations that helped provide space for negotiations so that people could come together around the Civil Rights Act. And today we have an advocacy program focused on criminal justice and ending mass incarceration. So there are also ways that these issues have evolved over time out of a similar concern. Another thing that has been really consistent and that is really important is that this belief in legislative change that comes out of a partnership between staff in DC and people across the country who are talking to their legislatures. You know, even back in the 1940s and 50s, FCNL was putting out newsletters on how to engage with your members of Congress, which at that time involved, you know, letters, postcards, and now may more involve email and phone calls and things like that. But this has never really been about Quakers asking a few people to do the work or sort of offloading this responsibility onto a few people. It's been about this community organizing to do it together. Another important thing, and that gets to what Renee was talking about with relationship building and trying to connect with people, is that FCNL has been a nonpartisan organization. That means that we are open to talking and hearing from people and elected leaders with a variety of positions. It doesn't mean that we think all of their positions are correct or moral or something that we support, but we work really hard to be open to the conversation to see where that leads us. And all of these things, come out of this Quaker belief that everyone has value, both the people in the policies that we're trying to put forward and also the legislatures that we're speaking with. And all of them have access to hear God's word. It's not necessary to be a Quaker to lobby this way or to think these are, ideas worth pursuing. This definitely connects with many faith traditions and can be a way of connecting across faith traditions when we're doing this advocacy. So I want to share another video that talks a little bit about what this approach to lobbying looks like. And then after this, I'll get to a few stories because I think that's sometimes the most interesting and helpful way to get a sense of how this all works in practice. Oh, and this is Ruth Flower, who is the former head of our legislative program.
Of our faith as Quakers, that we talk to everybody. We just do. And that's been kind of a slogan that we use in our various coalitions that we're in when nobody wants to talk to a certain office, and they'll say, the Quakers will talk to them. I will confess, I will look at their websites and think, oh my goodness, this is going to be uncomfortable. But we'll go in and, introduce ourselves and ask them what they think about this issue, this problem, and work on having an open conversation. And we'll have an open conversation. It's the most amazing thing. I surprise myself over and over again. When I enter an office to lobby anybody, and I don't care what side of the aisle they're on, I'm always nervous. And I do remind myself that God is in the room and that there's that of God in everyone, including in myself. Brings me strength, brings me joy, and in the person that I'm speaking with. I can lose track of that during the conversation if a few things are said that kind of shock me, but that it's kind of like deep breathing to go back to that understanding that there's that of God in this person, and that's who I'm speaking to. That's who I'm speaking to. I'm not speaking to the fear. I'm not speaking to whatever training the person has given themselves to get through the world as they see it. I'm speaking to their better part, to that of God.
So Ruth really summarizes there, I think, the way that Quakers and FCNL approach lobbying, that it's about listening. It's not going and assuming you have the right answer, but it's about listening and being open to learning from the other person. It's about disagreeing with ideas and not people. There's some subtleties of language there, but I think we try very hard not to dismiss the whole person, but recognize that we can disagree with an idea they hold while also holding out that there is something of God in them. And it's thinking about the integrity of the whole process, not just are we uplifting a position that is moral and right, but how are we putting that forward in a way that also recognizes that of God in the people affected by these policies? Whose voices are we making room for in the conversation? How are we practicing love and patience with each other? Organizing a lobby visit can be very stressful And so sometimes that is in some ways the hardest part of the whole thing, is having love and patience for each other. And also thinking about how we can be effective allies in the work, especially when the policies are ones that don't directly affect us as mostly white Quakers. A good example of that is the work we do around Native American advocacy, which is a long-standing program of FCNL going back to the 1970s. But one of the things that's very important about that program is that we work in partnership with Native organizations, particularly the National Congress of American Indians, and really take our lead from them in terms of the policies that they are advancing and wanting to promote. So it's not, us as an outsider coming in and saying, we know the best thing for your community, we're going to advocate for this thing for you, even if that's not what they want. It's really saying, how can we help you advance the things that are most important to you? All of these are difficult, and we are all imperfect, and we're all working on them. But that is the approach that we take. And I know that one of the next upcoming sessions will get more into detail about this approach to lobbying. But now I want to tell you a few stories before I turn it over to some discussion and questions and things like that about how all this works. So one is a story about the power of faith-based advocacy and making faith connections across different faith traditions. This is our former lobbyist on peace building, Theo Sither, was able to connect and influence Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma, who is one of the most conservative senators. And Theo really approached his relationship with this office as a person of faith, speaking to the senator as a person of faith from a different faith, but it allowed them to have a point of connection. They often didn't agree on policies. We would ask them to do things and they would say no, or they would be obstructionist on things we wanted them to do. But the fact that there was this basis to start the conversation meant that the conversation could continue. And sometimes that is a victory in itself, just living to see another day of the conversation. So we had this relationship, and then there was a point where there were escalating tensions in the country of Burundi. And it turned out that Senator Inhofe was friends with the president of Burundi. And through this connection that we had established with his office, we were able to help arrange some diplomatic conversations that the State Department was having trouble getting set up. So even though we were coming at our faith from a different direction, perhaps, we were able to find this point of connection and have a way to have influence in a moment that where it was important. Another story about being open to conversation and relationship building is also about the work we do in peace building, which is really about putting forward, not just waiting until there's a crisis and saying, oh no, what can we do? We must send in the military because we have no other option, but thinking about how do we build up the infrastructure so that we don't have to do that, so that we can stop crises before they happen and have better alternatives to conflict prevention. So this story starts in 2015 when FCNL held a lobby day in Washington that was focused on building support for a particular piece of legislation around peace building. And there was a group that came together from North Carolina that were headed in to speak with Senator Tillis. And they realized that they were going to be meeting with a military officer who was temporarily working in the senator's office. And they were pretty upset by that because they were like, we're going to go in and talk about peace building and not spending money on the Pentagon to this military person, and he's just going to, laugh us off, and he's not going to listen to us. But they listened to all of the lobby training that they got and this approach of, being open and all of that. And they were committed to this meeting and listening and trying to see if there was a way that they could connect. And in the end, they were able to find a connection around a concern for veterans and the cost of war for the people who were involved in it. And by the end of the meeting, the aide had promised to convey their request to support this legislation on preventing genocide and atrocities to the senator, who actually wound up being the first Republican co-sponsor of this bill, which was signed into law in 2019 as the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act by President Trump. And the fact that this group was able to establish this relationship, and through it, FCNL was able to build a relationship with this office, also opened up other ways that we could work with the senator on issues not related to peace building, issues related to making sure that non-citizen families could receive COVID stimulus funding, and extending SNAP benefits during the pandemic so that people could afford food. Now, Senator Tillis is not always somebody that we agree with. And, but once again, finding a way to open this relationship and have a conversation sometimes has led to some surprising results. I'll share two more things, and then I want to make sure we have some time for conversation. One is about more directly about the interfaith work that FCNL does. We are part of a group of faith advocacy organizations called the Washington InterReligious Staff Community. And I will paste that link in the chat. And this is really from a lot of denominations, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, you know, people who are doing lobbying work in DC. And there are a number of working groups and coalitions that come out of that. And a number of our staff are leading on those issues, including Native American advocacy, environmental advocacy, and immigration. And through those groups, we are able to organize lobby visits, vigils, rallies, collaborative efforts to lift up faith voices. Oftentimes, you know, having one faith group say something is nice to an office, but if you have 40 or 50 faith groups saying it, then they might sit up and pay attention. And also, it's been helpful to organize strategically when we know that a particular member, you know, listens to, for example, the Catholic bishops in a particular way. You know, it gives us connections to help figure out what's the most influential. And in fact, I think this interfaith work is how FCNL got connected to you all through some organizing work that we did last summer. And then as an example of what this can, you know, lead to, just last week, we were part of an effort that was led by the Episcopalian Church in DC to organize a vigil on Ukraine. And we had about 1,000 people that joined online and really provided space for people of many faiths to share, pray, and witness together on the day before the invasion. So that is a really important part of the work that we do. And then the last thing I want to share is about persistence. You know, we talked about this idea of doing the right thing, even though you're not necessarily going to see the results. And one example of that I really appreciate is the work that we have done on working to repeal the authorizations for the use of military force that were passed in 2001, 2002, right after 9/11. And those gave the president, whoever that was, a blank check to use military force without having to go through the usual channels of getting congressional authorization. And I was actually working at FCNL on 9/11 as an intern. And it was really an amazing experience in a lot of ways, because a lot of organizations in the days after those attacks were really struggling on whether they should support the Iraq invasion, you know, whether war could ever be justified. And FCNL put out a statement on the day after, on the 12th of September, that said, war is not the answer. and they put that sign up on our building, which is across the street from the Senate. And I appreciate that clear sense of what our faith called us to do, that we didn't have to question what we believed, but we could uphold our opposition to violence and focus on how we were going to work to build peace. And these authorizations have been on the books since then, have been used by all these administrations since then to use military force, drones, those sorts of things. And FCNL has been working pretty intently on repealing them, on the belief that going to war should never be an easy decision, and that it's important to have the opportunity for debate and discussion and conversation about consequences, and consider other options rather than giving one person in the White House the opportunity to make that decision for themselves. And gradually, over time, we've gotten to the point where some of those repeals have passed the House. We haven't quite got them all the way through yet, but that's been at least a 20-year process, working slowly, having these conversations, being in many points where it feels like we're not getting anywhere, but always coming back and having those conversations. And of course, I could share lots of stories about frustration, where the relationships don't work, where people are sort of at a low point and don't know how to have hope on things. And that's part of the work too. And that's part of why doing the work in community, whether it's a faith community, an interfaith community, a community of people who care about the same issues, is really important. But I wanted to share these stories of when it's worked or when we've made progress, because I think it's important to remember that sometimes it does work. And that, as Keith Ellison said, sometimes we can do things to increase the odds, even if the result isn't up to us.
I'm interested in what your process is for, you mentioned there's a process in place for determining what issues are important to congregations and members, and I'm interested if you could describe that process a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So we sort of have two sets of policy, or we have a very extensive, what we call our legislative policy statement, which lays out all of the issues that we could potentially take a position on. And that is something that is looked at periodically, but not every year. And I will put a link to that in the chat. And then for every session of Congress, we ask Quaker meetings and churches around the country and other organizations to sort of sit with that policy and say, out of all of the possible things we could work on, what are the issues that arise for your community that are the most important to focus on in the next 2 years? And there are lots of different ways that communities do that, what we call discernment. Sometimes they will collect information from individual people and then sort of see what, where things are trending, and then, come together as a group to sort of refine that list. There have been some really creative things done with, putting up pieces of paper around a meeting house and, people writing things down about what is most important to them. It's very, it's something that provides information to us about what communities, what is important to communities, but it's also a really helpful process for the communities themselves. If it comes through sitting with the issues and the concerns that the community has, you know, to say these are the top things for this group of people that we want to see happen. And even if that doesn't wind up being one of the things that other communities say is a priority, and so it doesn't wind up on the list of what FCNL does, that process for that one community has been really helpful, because then it's helping sort of focus them on the things that they're interested in. You know, I think FCNL does quite a bit of lobby training where we'll do sort of workshops and things like that. And obviously we focus those around the issues that we're trying to move on Capitol Hill and with Congress, but, you know, the skills are applicable across issues. So, you know, even if a group wants to lobby on something that isn't one of the issues that we're working on, we are very happy to teach the skills and how to do a lobby visit and all that to help them do that.
So our next session, which will happen 1 month from today on March 28th at the same time, will be with a different representative from SCNL on the topic of lobby training and how to engage Congress. Is there anything more to add to the content of that meeting? Either Alicia or Shada have been in conversation about that session. Is there anything to add on what we can anticipate next month?
Well, one thing is that oftentimes in a lobby training, a piece of legislation will be used as an example to help give concrete instructions. And so the Social Justice Committee of, you know, the Swedenborgian Church of North America just recently put out a survey. Maybe a number of you replied to it, and if you did, thank you so much. Asking, you know, the denomination at large what they felt like their justice priorities were. So that was our small version of what Alicia was describing, trying to find consensus so we can make some priorities around our work. And the justice issue that came up on top was climate justice. So we asked the presenter of the next program whether or not we could use some sort of climate legislation as an example to be used in the next session. And she said, yes, of course, she has something in mind. So that's just to let folks know that in the parts of the training that require some specifics, we'd be working with something like that.
Excellent. Okay, and in order to register for that, Shada, what should people do?
Yes, so the registration link that you clicked on to be able to get your Zoom link for this event would have given you 4 options to register for. And so the meeting for March would have been one of those options. So you might have clicked all of them for all of the rest of the sessions. And if you did, that's awesome. You will receive your link, I think. Actually, I'm not a Zoom expert. I'm doing this for the first time, but that link should be sent to you automatically at some point in the next few weeks, probably twice. We'll end up sending a reminder as well. But please do feel free to contact me if you have any confusion about that at all. My email is all over all of the promotional materials, but it's just revshada@gmail.com. And to let me know if you have any questions. But if you just happen to click just today's registration, you could just go back into the registration link and register for further ones as well. So that's that.
Well, let's all extend our thanks to Alicia McBride for spending this time with us and giving us such an inspiring overview of what's happening with your organization. I think we all have a lot to think about. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. And I particularly appreciate the knitters. I'm usually one of the people that's knitting on on programs. I can't do it when I'm talking, but I see you.
Nice. Excellent. All right. Be well, everyone. We'll hopefully see you back here in a month.